So my name is Dr. Tom Langley, or Tom. I am a teaching fellow in the Department of Comparative Literature, but I'm also the department's admissions tutor. So I'm the kind of first person to talk to you about how admissions work for the department if you have any questions about that. And if you do apply to us, I'll be the person who, if there's any questions around your application, I'll be the person who'll be looking at that application too. There's lots of reasons to study at King's. There's lots of reasons why King's is a fantastic place to study. It's an old established institution founded in 1829. It's a centre of academic excellence. You're working with some of the best in the world here, some of the best in the country. It's, you know, not just in terms of staff, but in terms of the kind of students you're interacting with. And it's also right in the heart of London, with everything on your doorstep. So if you want theatres, if you want art galleries, if you want entertainment of any kind, it's right here. If you want libraries, it's a fantastic place to be studying literature, to be just down the road from the British Library, to be just down the road from the Senate House Library. Kind of everything is right at your fingertips here, and it really does make a huge difference to the kind of work we can do as a department. But I want to move past this, and I want to talk about what comparative literature is. It's not a new idea. It's a very old idea. And it's one that's kind of coming back into fashion, in a sense, in the UK academy. It's actually kind of been the default way that you study literature in North America and in most of Western Europe for quite a long time. But it's getting more and more common back in the UK as well, which is great to see. And each department takes it slightly differently. But it's not a new idea, and it goes back hundreds of years. And one of the places that we could trace it back to is this guy, Goethe. So Goethe is a novelist, a poet, and a philosopher, a thinker. And he is really interested in reading as much as he can from as many different places as he can. And he reads in a variety of different languages, but he also reads a lot in translation. And he goes through one kind of phase in which he's reading a lot of writing and translation from Persian and from Chinese. And he reads what he thinks, or what he describes as a Chinese novel. It wouldn't have been thought of as a novel by the person writing it or by a Chinese audience, but he sees it as a Chinese novel. And for him, it reminds him of all that is best about German literature and English literature, and it stands in contrast to the utter depravity of French literature. What he's trying to do really is draw connections in a kind of broader world of literature. And he says this at the end of this conversation to his secretary, a guy called Eckermann, who writes, kind of follows Goethe around for all of his life and kind of writes down everything that he says and publishes it posthumously. So this is a conversation they have 30 years before this. And it's a really famous piece of writing. He says, "I am more and more convinced that poetry is the universal possession of mankind." By poetry here, really he means all literary expression, basically. Revealing itself everywhere and at all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. I, therefore, like to look about me in foreign nations and advise everyone to do the same. National literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. Now, there are two ideas that I think are really interesting, or two kind of elements of this that I think are really interesting and worth talking about here. One is this fascinating phrase, national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. What does he mean by that? He's writing at a moment in which, historically, two things are happening, really. The nation is becoming the default way in which we think about ourselves in collective terms. At this moment in time, we're increasingly, if we think about the advent of Italian nationalisms, of German nationalisms, of new forms of French nationalisms, and so on, the nation is becoming the way we think about ourselves in the plural. At the same time, the way that we read is changing. And the novel is now becoming the kind of dominant way that we read. And there's this interesting kind of connection that is born at this moment between literature and nation, and this idea of a national literature. And Goethe here is trying to undo this. And his point is roughly this. If I was to talk to you about, I don't know, Canadian neuroscience, or Algerian dentistry, or Spanish astrophysics, do those things make sense to you? Why not? It's a genuine question. Why not? We expect those things to be universal. We expect those things to cover the globe, to be the same everywhere, or at least to allow us to have a conversation everywhere. But if I was to say to you English literature or French literature, I imagine you have a very clear sense already just instantly of what I might be talking about, the kinds of text that might fit into that, the kind of text we might ignore from that. Why is that, basically? His point is that English literature is not necessarily any more meaningful as a term than Algerian dentistry. And he wants to try and undo this and see what happens if we unpick this connection between nation and literature. The other is this idea that he says at the end, the epoch of world literature is at hand and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. And I think this is a really good way of thinking about how we approach comparative literature, which is that it's not just something that exists, it's not a body of knowledge that you guys will just be kind of passively imbibing. Instead, it's a kind of call, it's a call to arms. It's a project that all of us have to work on collectively together. And each one of you, if you choose to come and study comparative literature with us, each one of you will have a slightly different answer to what comparative literature is to you and what you're interested in and what route you take through it. So it's also a kind of project. It's something that we're kind of inventing all the time. And it's part of what makes it, I think, such a fascinating area to work in, to teach, and of course to study as well. So we might think that Goethe writing in 1827 was perhaps potentially a little bit premature in announcing this new epoch of world literature. We could maybe make a better argument about our own epoch. If you look, for example, at winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature over the last couple of decades, it's a prize that traditionally has largely been won by North America, by Western and Northern Europe. And now in the last kind of 2 decades, we've had writers win it from China. We've had Mo Yan, Gao Jingzhan win it from China. We've had V.S. Naipaul from Trinidad and from King's. He was a King's student too. And then even just a couple of years ago, we had Bob Dylan win it, kind of crossing another threshold and bringing us into music as well. So maybe we're in a better position now to think seriously about this moment of this epoch of world literature that Goethe anticipates. This is our kind of sense of what comparative literature is. Comparative literature is the study of literature beyond the borders of one particular country or cultural group, and the study of interactions between literature and other forms of human expression, including the arts, the sciences, and cultural artifacts of all kinds. We might think of sculpture, we might think of music here. Literature doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens alongside all kinds of other elements of human endeavour. So what are those interactions doing? In other words, it's the study of literature across time, across space, and across forms. We cover about 2,500 years of literary expression, and we have about 12 languages covered in the department. You yourselves can push that in new directions and new frontiers if you wish to. And we cover 6 continents worth of material. Nobody can do all of that. Nobody can know all of that stuff. The point is that you get to design your own itinerary through it. With us, working with us, you get to work out what it is that interests you in all of this material, what kinds of connections you can forge. So we offer 3 degree programs. We offer the BA in Comparative Literature, the BA in Comparative Literature with Film, which is a 75-25 split. So it's 75% with us, 25% with our good friends in the film department, and the BA in Classical Studies and Comparative Literature. They're all slightly different. The BA in Comparative Literature has a requirement for you to have, as an entry requirement, for you to have a B in GCSE in a language, or an equivalent way of demonstrating to me as admissions tutor that you have an interest with, an engagement with the study of other languages. This is because linguistic study is woven into what we do. We firmly believe, we read largely in translation, but we firmly believe that there's something to be gained in also trying to get to grips with more than one literary culture in its own language, on its own terms. This might not necessarily mean that you become fluent in the language, but it will hopefully mean that your reading experience is enriched by it. It might be that you get to the stage, say you want to pick up an entirely new language, and you want to use one of your optional modules each year to pick up Arabic at the Modern at the Modern Language Centre just down the road from us. It might be by the end of your degree, you're able to read comfortably with the original in one hand, the translation in the other hand, and a dictionary in your third magical hand, which is helping you through this process. And through that, get a different sense of what the text is and how it's doing. And also, it's a great way of helping us not take translation for granted. Most of the reading in the world happens in translation, and it's so omnipresent that it becomes invisible to us. And part of what I think is really interesting about kind of making ourselves engage with other languages as well as literatures, is that it makes us dwell on this process of translation and see translation as something kind of active that's happening in our text. Basically, the way that this kind of is examined in your study, and this is just for the BA in Comparative Literature, is that you would be encouraged in dialogue with your personal tutor to weave this language use, whether it's by taking a language class or by taking a module that allows you to read a novel, for example, or a poem in your chosen language throughout your first, second, and third years. And this is building towards the moment in your third year where you will produce a dissertation, a totally original comparative piece of work, which will compare 2 different literary texts from 2 different cultures. And in that, we'll be expecting you to kind of showcase what you can bring to bear on your reading of the text, and that will include your linguistic skill. You're not being examined on how good you are in that language, you're being examined on your ability to help it open up text for you and for your reader. So broadly speaking, we might think of there being 4 ways of comparing literary texts and 4 ways in which we kind of structure our modules. By theme, by genre, by historical period, and the last one's kind of difficult to explain without context. I'll be fleshing that out in a moment. But by comparing it across nations, by interacting with literature that already thinks of itself as global, in a sense. So the first one, for example, the writer in the text, it's a module that starts with Sappho, starts with ancient Greek poetry, and goes all the way through to the 21st century. It covers, I think, 11 different languages in 7 different forms, from poetry to short stories to film, and it's designed to introduce you to as much new material as possible, basically. That's kind of the below the surface aim of this module, is to give you a plethora of things to choose from. The only thing that these texts have in common at all, really, they're all incredibly different, whether it's Dante's Inferno, whether it's Sappho, whether it's Emily Dickinson. The thing that they share is a sustained focus on the role of the artist, a sustained focus on the process of artistic creation. And it's always represented slightly differently. So for Emily Dickinson, for example, writing is about privacy. It's about being cloistered away. It's about writing the self in a very kind of particular way. For Sappho, it's about proclaiming yourself to the gods. It's about searching for divine inspiration above you. It's a very different concept of authorhood. And so it allows us to kind of chart changes and chart differences in these texts and to bring to light things that we might not see in these texts if we just looked at them on their own. So that's thinking about it by theme. And there's all kinds of different themes that we might choose. The next is comparing by genre or by form. So this is a module that I teach in the first year, Forms of Shorter Narrative, which is really fun. We're not just thinking about the short story here. We start right back with the shorter narratives that we get, for example, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the Quran, in medieval narratives, in French classical drama, and then we move towards what we might think of as the modern short story, which starts kind of really in the 1800s, really kind of starts to gather steam. And the question that we're asking here, or the questions we're asking here is there something specific about shorter narrative forms that lends itself to certain kinds of readly experience? Does it make us interact with text in a particular way? Is there something about their brevity, about the way in which they just drop us into this world with a few short pages notice and then abandon us after a few more pages? All of these texts play with similar themes, similar ideas. The boundaries between what's real and what's not real, our kind of problematic relationship with narrative voices. Do we trust the people who are talking to us? They're concerned with a kind of fleetingness of life. So is there something that we can say about the shorter narrative form, about the short story potentially in particular, that makes it special, that makes it different? So this is a way of reading and thinking about, as it were, literary technology. What kind of technology is the short story form? What does it allow us to do, and what does it allow us to do that is special or different? The next is kind of similar, but we're thinking here much more specifically about a historical period. So we're thinking here about the rise of the novel in 18th century Europe, and why it comes from this particular moment. What is the relationship, for example, between the kind of incredible rise of the novel as a reading technology? If you ask someone, what are you reading at the moment? Really, probably what you're asking them is, what novel are you reading at the moment? We tend to think of novels as kind of having monopolized our kind of creative reading. Historically, that wouldn't really have been true. We would have thought a lot more about poetry. We would have thought a lot more about other forms of literary expression. The novel's now kind of central to us. And it comes from this moment. Why? What is it about this moment that makes this possible, that makes it happen? And what do these novels share in terms of the kinds of narrative tropes, the ways in which they're structured, the relationship between the narrative voice and the protagonist, the way in which they generate individuals, really. In lots of ways, the novel is a really good literary form for generating individual narratives. It's very different, for example, from the epic, which encourages us to think about a range of narratives in more or less equal forms. So the final is genres of world literature. Again, all of these are first-year modules. All of these are modules that you could expect to be taking either as core modules or as optional modules in your first year if you came to study with us. Genres of world literature encourages us to think about writing which comes from outside of those perhaps more firmly established literary canons of French, English, German literature. Writing that is always kind of arguing for space, that is always kind of angling for space in a global literary marketplace. So we look at writing from Nigeria, from Palestine, and from Latin America, and think about the ways in which these texts position themselves in various ways as worldly, the ways in which they are interested in mediating local content for international audiences. Do these texts kind of try and explain any strange or unusual words that they're providing to an English audience? How do they think about, how do they represent process of translation? How do they represent the world and the way in which characters and readers move in the world? So each of these are kind of very different ways of thinking about how we compare literary texts. And each of them provide us with different avenues into them. But hopefully that gives you a glimpse of the kinds of work that you might be doing. As you go on in your degree, as we'll see in a moment, your interest becomes more and more specialized, and you get to increasingly choose exactly what it is you want to do. I always like to think of the degree structured as kind of like an upside-down triangle with the broad bit at the top. We take you from everything you could want to know to exactly the thing you want to know. And the kind of point on that is your dissertation, which nobody else will have done anything like before. You'll be the first person to do exactly that kind of work. So the way the degree is structured, as I've just said, is that we start with more core modules, so modules that we expect you to take. So it's 4 in the first year, 2 in the second year, and then in the third year, you have much more free choice. The option modules that you're taking here, some of them, particularly in the first and second year, we want you to take with us. We want you to stay with us. We're jealous of you. We don't want you going too far afield. But in each year, you have some, and increasingly more and more as we go through, options that you can take from outside our department as well. We have agreements with all kinds of departments in the faculty. So if you want to take modules with Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American studies, if you want to take modules with German, if you want to take modules with theology, if you want to take modules with digital humanities, there are all kinds of options available for you, and it's a further way in which you can tailor your degree to being exactly kind of what you want it to be about. And then these are some of the option modules that you could be choosing at each stage. I should say that this varies slightly year on year, depending on staff availability, depending on if we've created new modules or if we're reviving other things, but this is a kind of representative sample. So just to give a couple of examples here, the Faust tradition is a really fun module which looks at the Faust legend, the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil from the 16th century through to the 20th century, and looks at how it plays out in all kinds of different forms, from plays to operas to films. So we're thinking there about, again, kind of by theme, but really we're thinking about what happens if the same story gets told and retold from place to place. Another example would be, this is a module I teach, which I find really, really fun, literature, solidarity, and the humanitarian turn. And here we're thinking about the ways in which, at a certain point in the 20th century, the language of human rights and humanitarianism becomes absolutely central, and it becomes central to the way that we think about our relationships with causes outside of our immediate location. So we're interested here in the ways in which literary texts make use of this. How do they use or resist or change or subvert the language and imagery of human rights discourse? How do they make appeals to us as readers? How do they make us feel things? And what do they want us to do with those feelings? Is it just about feeling empathy, or do these texts try and design a way in which we might kind of get involved, as it were? And what kinds of pressures might be acting on authors coming, for example, from contexts of conflict? I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. Do come and talk to us if you have any questions. Feel free. Oh, you guys are too nice.